Shavua Tov. The Talmud teaches that the ability to foretell the future has been taken away from prophets and is now found only among idiots and children. And I am no child. Which means anyone who pretends to know the future is deluded or lying. Imagine if you were alive in the year 1900. What would you have expected in the coming 100 years? I can tell you 3 things you would not have anticipated. You would not have anticipated World War II. You would not have anticipated the civil rights movement. You would not have anticipated the women's liberation movement. For sure, you wouldn't know about Stonewall and LGBT liberation. You wouldn't have known what the T stood for at all. In fact, most of the significant things that have occupied us from the 20th century were unanticipated in the 19th century. So odds are good that we haven't a clue what the next 100 years are going to bring. Nonetheless, we like to plan. And we like to try to anticipate. Cultural reference. So thank you. I'm glad somebody got it. My rabbinical students, by the way, think I'm having a mini stroke when I do that. Right? Ignoramuses. Rocky Horror Picture Show. And 3 points from Hufflepuff. Jeez. But we might try to derive some guidance from the past. Where have we headed? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And what might we try to be aiming for in the future? So I'd like to do a kind of running scan of the American Jewish historical experience, and then with you admit my ignorance, but make some guesses, standing here on the edge of the cliff, looking out over the abyss and having no idea what's out there, but trying to figure out what it is I see out there. So when Jews first came to this country, we came, mostly Sephardic Jews, because we were fleeing the Catholic Church and European anti-Semitism. The New World wasn't much better, right? Certainly the Latin American states were governed by the Inquisition, no less than was Spain and the rest of the Spanish-speaking world. The New Amsterdam colony was pretty viciously anti-Semitic. Peter Stuyvesant, who is now a filthy high school in New York, which talk about just desserts, did not welcome Jews. We had to promise to care for our own, to not be a burden on civil society, to not interfere in any way. Interestingly, the Jews who came before the 1880s largely disappeared. HUC at its centennial tried to organize a gathering for its descendants of its first alumni and discovered that none of them were Jewish. That's not a criticism of HUC, it's that there were no Jewish infrastructure, no Jewish numbers of significance to sustain a population. And I also want to just point out sociologically that in America, most immigrant groups make it about 4 generations tops, and then they melt away, right? So you'll often look at an actor who is Scottish, French, German, Scandinavian. That's just a way of saying that everybody has been mingling for multiple generations, and they are just seeing themselves as American. So 4 generations seems to be the limit. Where are we at right now? Your kids count. Okay? So that first batch of Jews, Sephardic, barely organized, they created a scattering of congregations, Charleston, New York, Boston, other places, but those mostly melted away. The real beginning of Jewish life in America was a second beginning, which was in the 1880s. And we owe deep gratitude to Tsar Alexander. My friends at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, where they have a large Persian population, routinely thank the Ayatollah. But he was, among other virtues, a vicious anti-Semite, and organized official pogroms, and that was the time where Jews decided, maybe we'll try this new world out there. Worse it cannot be. And so that started one of the largest human migrations in history. In the course of some 40 years, about millions of Jews came from the Pale of Settlement, which was to say Poland and Western Russia. 80% of American Jews to this day are Ashkenazic. Witness that you greet each other with Good Shabbos, which is a very Ashkenormative thing. I'll just tell you that in LA we don't do that anymore. So start practicing Shabbat Shalom, because it's coming. And this was the first generation that came to America with a clear agenda. Their agenda was to have people stop clobbering us and stop beating us up and give us the space to earn a living. So this is the famous age of the Lower East Side, of the Jewish Daily Forwards, which was at the time a daily Yiddish socialist newspaper. There was a flowering of Yiddish theater, Yiddish literature. Jews were largely concentrated in the Northeast. And the goal of Jewish institutions was to try to make room for us in the larger society. So the kinds of institutions that got formed was the YMHA, right? The YMCA at the time was a Christian missionary organization. We tried to create the Hebrew equivalent. We created synagogues, we created Landsmannschaft organizations with the Lithuanian Jews could hang out with Lithuanian Jews, and the Latvian Jews could hang out with the Latvian Jews, and the Romanians with the Romanians. The Jews who had gotten here first were the German Jews. And they wanted nothing to do with the Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews. I personally grew up at Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. Watch the giggling there. It's a beautiful place. Right? Of course, we were not German Jews, but we aspired. And the "please, sir, take off your hat, you are in the house of God" was very much in the spirit of German Jewry. That wasn't a fluke, that was an ideology. Right? It was an ideology. We are going to out-Americanize these Americans. We are going to produce a service of such beauty and decorum that they will think that ours is more dignified and then give us civil rights, which is a reasonable strategy if you're talking about people whose anti-Semitism is based on reason. Turns out that's problematic. right? But those were the kinds of Emmanuel in New York. How many of you have ever been to Temple Emmanuel in New York? It is the most gorgeous cathedral in the United States. And it's built like stained glass windows, rose window, the whole works. It was meant to be a place that the silk stocking set could walk into and feel like this was something they were comfortable with. You could bring your Gentile business associates to your children's celebration, and there would be nothing parochial about it. The goal was to establish that we Jews could be as normal as anyone else, as American as anyone else. Of course, at the time, we all had thick Yiddish accents. So the only place we could relax was at our social clubs. And we had social clubs because they wouldn't let us join their social clubs, right? In Los Angeles, there's a Jewish country club called Hillcrest, right? Famous for, among other things, they used to have a table where Jack Benny and George Burns and Milton Berle and others every Friday would sit. Can you imagine? I would kill to sit at that table, right? But the club was formed because the Beverly Hills Country Club wouldn't admit us, right? So we had to have our own. That was replicated around the country. We started bungalows in upstate, and we did that because we needed our vacation place to go to because we couldn't go to theirs, which created a vibrant and weird Jewish culture in which everyone was Jewish and we were doing entirely not Jewish activities, because when you want to know, like, what do you do at a club? Well, you look at the Goyish club, and then you create so we also had parcheesi and, we played the Chinese mahjong, Jewish mahjong, but that's because that's what you do at a country club. And we served shrimp salad, and we had golf, which we did not have in the old country. Right? We did these things. We had Christmas parties every year and New Year's parties. Like, we did what they did at their country club. We did at ours because that's what country clubs do, apparently. And that was a measure of success. Because what that did was it socialized its members, and even more, its members' children, to what being American entailed. Those kids went to public school. They got an American education. It was a pretty racist education. It was a pretty classist education. It was a very hetero education, but it was what was the American education, which means these kids grew up severed from their parents, right? The parents were immigrants. They had a foot in the old world. There's an interesting thing that happens in Yiddish literature. All of the Yiddish literature written in the old country speaks with rage about the shtetl. Rage. They hated. You're walking around in cow slop all the time. The place is filthy, and on your good days, the Cossacks rape you. It's not a good place. Then they moved to Brooklyn, and they started to miss it. So Anatevka was born in Brooklyn. He's writing for an American paper, and he misses it. So he's writing about the world that he's lost, which of course is not the world his parents were desperate to flee, right? So that's where you get the longing for a place starts when you're not there anymore. Okay, but then the needs of the second generation are not the same as the first. What they need is not a place where they can be safely Jewish. They need to start building bridges into larger America. They want into corporate America. They want into American culture. Their kids are going to start going to medical school and law school. And they're going to start taking it out of they move out of the Lower East Side and into Brooklyn, right, which was the wild frontiers back in the day. My dad grew up in Brooklyn. He couldn't wait to leave Brooklyn. In his waning years, I would tell him, you can't afford a place in Brooklyn anymore. Brooklyn is hot. And he no, it cannot be. Trust me, Dad, Brooklyn is, you should have held on to the family estate. So we had to pivot. We started creating things like the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress. These are organizations that are not meant to shelter Jews. They're meant to take the fight out there. But notice they're not fighting for a content-filled identity. They're fighting for our ability to have the same jobs, live in the same neighborhoods. I'm not against those things. Well, partly I am, but we'll get there, right? But what they weren't fighting for was for Christmas not to be normative. They weren't fighting that fight. They weren't fighting the fight for Jewish holidays to have equal time, right? Or Hebrew to be taught in the public school. All they wanted was for us not to be disbarred from places. And they were incredibly successful at that. That's also the age we start founding in the 10s and 20s the various rabbinical schools, all of which have the same goal if you look at it sociologically. They have very big different religious and style differences, but they're all intending to make American rabbis. Up until that time, you could go to rabbinical school without having a college degree. What does one have to do with the other, right? But all of the rabbinical schools, by which I mean the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which became a conservative school. It did not start that way. It was meant to be a traditional school for everyone to the right of reform. HUC, which deliberately started as the liberal school, but then the conservatives peeled off of it. And then the Yeshiva University was created because they said to JTS, not going to happen. But all three schools require you have to have a BA, you young straight men, to get into rabbinical school. And they would teach you homiletics, which also was never taught in the yeshivas of Slobodka. Right? Homiletics is how you start with a funny story, and then you speak in mellifluous and elevated English, and then you end with a moral example that people can take with them into the week. Very goyish. Right? But that model, whether or not you keep kosher, whether or not you think people have to observe Shabbat in a traditional way, that model pervades all three schools to this day. Right? You are trained in pastoral counseling. You are trained in things that rabbis never studied. When I was a rabbinical student, I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering, which is a New York cancer hospital. And I knew I was in trouble whenever I would walk into a observant, frum person's room. Hi, I'm Rabbi Artson. And they would literally say to me, I don't have a chicken. Like, I'm dying of cancer. What are you here for? Right? Because that's not what rabbis do in really traditional, what does a rabbi have to do with your being a patient? That's a pastoral model that comes out of American Protestantism. But all three schools bought it because we were trying to present clergy in the American mode. And that's because these kids, now living in brownstones in Brooklyn, some of them moving to Los Angeles because the air was good for your lungs, remember those days, right? They wanted an American rabbinate. So that's the age where they build Wilshire Boulevard Temple, right? Gorgeous, gorgeous cathedral of a building in the Moorish style, like Emmanuel, because they're hearkening back to an imagined golden age in which Jews and Muslims and Christians all participated in a non-superstitious, scientifically literate culture. Never happened. But that was the vision. So Emmanuel looks like it belongs in Alhambra, right? Deliberately. They're not trying to look like a Eastern European place of worship. And they're announcing to America, when you look at the San Francisco skyline, you're going to see us. In Los Angeles, until very recently, if you drove on the main thoroughfare, the 405, and you would drive from the city to the valley or the valley to the city, there would be American Jewish University, Stephen Weiss Temple, Milken High School, and the Skirball Cultural Center. Four large, visible Jewish institutions that every single Los Angelino saw going in or out of the city. That's a remarkable statement. Okay, so for the second generation, what they're looking for differently than their parents, they want access. And so they're fighting to get into the colleges. Those are the kinds of fights they're having. They're doing anti-defamation fights. You can't exclude us. Harvard at the time had a quota. Yale at the time had a quota. We seem to be going back to those days. That's for another time. And what I want to point out, though, is that in each stage, they won. Like the generation that tried to create a safe place to de-immigrate the Jews succeeded. Their kids were de-immigrated. The generation that wanted to open up the doors to business and to commerce and to real estate, they succeeded. And then came what I think of as the third stage, and this is after World War II, after the GI Bill, after the eruption of the 60s and the civil rights movement and the women's movement, and after the establishment of the State of Israel. Remember all those old pictures of Jews that used to hang on synagogue walls? These old guys hunched over, looking at a book in the dark with a candle. That's our internalized self-image. By the way, it's still your self-image. Watch the following experiment. I'm going to say 3 words. I want you to picture something in your head. Don't edit it. Don't try to play a game with me. Just whatever picture pops into your head. Ready? A religious Jew. There he is. Half of you couldn't possibly look like that person, and the other half don't want to. Right? But that chassid on the brain is from way back then. What the State of Israel changed is we now have a statue on campus made by an Israeli artist of a Jew holding a Torah. In Eastern Europe, you held the Torah like this. You were protecting it. The statue is a guy holding the Torah like this. Right? We're putting it out there. We don't need your permission. And we got that from a combination of Zionism, civil rights movement, black liberation, and women's liberation. Right? And the model of seeing those people say, I don't have to look like you. I don't have to wear my hair like yours. I don't have to wear dress like you dress. I can be proud of my culture in a different way than you're proud of your culture. You are not normative. That became the biggest ripple in Jewish life. Right? We're still fighting that one out. I have a relative who's a fairly proud to be Jewish but very assimilated in style person. Every time I bring in a piece of Jewish art and I show it to them, they say, that's very nice, with that look on their face. And then what I hear from my sister is, they think it's too Jewish. Right? The rabbi's house is too Jewish. But that's because they're carrying with them something that women carry into a man's society, and LGBT people carry into a straight society, and black people carry into a white society, which is, when am I willing, how much of myself can I be here? How much of myself can I share with this room? And is it going to become an issue I just don't want to deal with? Or do I need to not enter the room, right? And for a lot of us Jews, that question happens all the time. How out am I going to be, right? What am I going to share on? What am I going to insist upon? But the 60s pivoted, that and the 7-Day War, and suddenly we could be free to be you and me too, right? And we could be proud and out there too. So our institutions changed. If you look at pictures of JTS graduates in 1910 and 20, the graduation photograph shows a group of male faculty members, a group of male rabbinical students, not a single kippah in the picture. Because there's no Jewish law that says you have to have your head covered for a photograph. Let's be very clear. You have to have your head covered to eat, pray, and study. So back in the day, the greatest Talmudist at JTS would walk into the cafeteria, carry his tray, sit down, take his kippah out of his coat pocket, put it on his head, say the blessing for food, put the kippah back in his head, eat the meal, put the kippah on his head, say Birkat Hamazon, put the kippah back in his pocket, and walk out. There isn't a rabbinical school today that looks like that. HUC, the Reform Rabbinical School, is festooned with kippot, because what's shifted is Judaism is no longer just theological, it's identity. And so that's what I want to leave us with. The world has shifted, but our rhetoric hasn't. We still operate primarily through houses of worship. But there's a significant number of Jews, some of whom admit it, some of whom don't. The largest growing group of Jews in the last several population studies are people who say they are very proud to be Jewish, and they are not practitioners of any religion. They check off none when it comes to religion, because their Jewishness has nothing to do with religion. They have a Seder because they're Jewish, right? They might even gather for a Friday night meal at which they say Kiddush and light Shabbos candles because they're Jewish. That has nothing to do with being religious. And in a way, Israel is part of that revolution. Israel is a nation, and it's a national movement. And you can be Israeli and not believe in a supernatural deity who's controlling. Here's the most interesting, in the latest study that they did, of the people who are not Jewish by religion, who do not believe in God, they answer no to that question. 10% of them believe God gave us the land of Israel. I have given a lot of thought to this. And all I can say on this subject is people are weird. But what do we do with the data that if you're expecting the institutions that met the need of wave 3 to meet the need of wave 4, you will fail. You'll fail. They don't want to join their grandparents' synagogue. They don't practice their grandparents' Judaism. A study done in Los Angeles by the Federation measured Jewish cliques. How many times in the week do you do something Jewish, think something Jewish, talk to someone Jewish, engage in Jewish activity? 2 different population extremes, 30 and under, 60 and over. Which one had the greatest number of weekly clicks? 30 and under. Well, sure, because there are all kinds of Jewish blogs and podcasts and websites, and they don't define Jewish as come to a talk at a time that a rabbi is scheduled to talk. They don't do anything that way, right? They do whatever they do when they want to do it, when they can click on their iPhone. So they're doing Jewish. They're even having Shabbos meals with each other. They're not members of synagogues. They're not affiliated dues-paying members of Jewish institutions. We have not figured out how to monetize this, right? And we also, and that's not, I'm not being cynical here, right? When the time comes, they're going to expect Rabbi Steinberg to answer the phone, right? It's just they haven't thought about the fact that someone's got to pay for that until they're ready to make the phone call, right? So they're going to expect this place to be there for them. What do you mean you won't do that? You're a synagogue, they will say to you. I'm sure you get those calls, right? But we haven't figured out as a Jewish community, how do we meet the legitimate human needs of these people in a sustainable way? And that's our job. You can sit in judgment of them if you like. It's entertaining for a while. I will tell you, the thrill wears off. But if you're committed to a meaningful Jewish identity surviving, then you don't get a vote on what they do or think. They're not asking you. You just get to decide whether you use your resources to maximize the possibility of their engagement. And that's a hard question to ask. People always get mad at this point in the conversation because what I'm telling you is I need you to create programs you don't attend, right? A 25-year-old who walks in the room and looks around this room will walk out. You would have too when you were 25. You've now become those people. And it's unfair, and it's ridiculous, and there's a lot of joy in living with the crotchety and the elderly, of which I count myself one of the leading members. But you have to be my age to appreciate that. So we need to think together. In Marin, there are a lot of unaffiliated young Jews. There are also an awful lot of floating, drifting, unaffiliated people who would actually love much of what Judaism offers. But they are allergic to those front doors. And they're not coming in this room. They're not. So what can we bring to them? What can we offer them? I put out talks on YouTube, and I get hundreds of people who listen, comment, and don't follow through in any way, because that's their Jewish activity. Right? I have 92,000 likes on my Rabbi Facebook page, in part because I'm so easy to like. I resent that laugh. But in part because I try very hard to find pieces of wisdom in the Torah that don't speak to a parochial Jewish perspective. So here's my final point. I'm writing a book right now called Wells of Wisdom. And the premise of the book is that we make a mistake when we present Judaism as part of a trilogy of religions. Right? For a while it was Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. They got bumped. Now it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish. In the Bay Area, Buddhist, Jewish, and non-affiliated, right? But that's not how the world is looking at us right now. The world looks at us as embodying an ancient indigenous wisdom tradition. In the same way that you take advantage of yoga without for a moment deciding, do I want to be Hindu or not? And you meditate without deciding, are you actually a Buddhist or not? You're not, by the way, you're an American Buddhist, which is a sugar-coated Pop-Tart version of the authentic thing. Right? And I'm saying that as someone, I love Pop-Tarts. That's not an insult. We need to open up Jewish wisdom to the world, because our tradition has been making resilient, wise, strong people for millennia. And we have been forged in the fires of hell. And we have figured out, not me personally, but our ancestors, our sages, an elaborate technology of not just survival, but of thriving amidst challenge. And that's the time we're living in right now. We need to thrive in the midst of challenge. If they suck out all the oxygen out of your life, you won't be around to resist. Besides which, you're still dead at the end. So you might as well find a way to enjoy it, right? And Judaism offers us that. We are a bittersweet religion, right? We know how to cry and laugh at the same time. At my daughter's wedding, I did what all Jewish parents do, write a lot of checks. I do what all Jewish parents do. When we got to the dance and they started singing Od Yishama, I burst out in tears. Od Yishama is the prophet Jeremiah singing as the Jews are marching into exile from Jerusalem, someday there will be dancing and rejoicing. Someday there will be the sounds of bride and bridegroom singing and rejoicing and feasting. And we play that at every Jewish wedding because we're thinking, you lost in this family today. They tried to kill us. They failed in this family. We are going for another generation. You failed. My friends Hans and Martin were at the wedding, and they had tears in their eyes and said, "What are you guys crying about?" They're two non-Jews. I've known these guys since second grade. They're my brothers of another mother, the same way that Kathy is my sister. And they were crying because it was so beautiful. And because they were thinking, we don't have a feeling like this at our weddings, which they don't. At Martin's wedding, which was in Virginia, in a picket fence, they had Senator Danforth, who was an ordained minister, officiated the service. If he had plotzed, I could have finished the service. Dearly beloved, we're gathered together. I mean, we all know that wedding. That's the TV wedding, right? But that's when I realized that it's actually unusual at your child's wedding to cry because people tried to slaughter you and failed. Other people don't feel that at a wedding of their children. But we all do, like all of us, that's what we're feeling, among other things. That's what we're feeling, and that's real. There's wisdom here. We know how to make meaning. We know how to hold on to an identity, just even when everyone thinks that you're demonic. We know how to, at great cost, resist internalizing that. And the world needs that. There's nobody who doesn't need that. So can we present Judaism as a wisdom technology for human thriving? I believe that's the need of the next generation. It's not pick and choose. It's deeper than that. It's trusting the God within each person to discern what they need to stay lit, and then giving them in an open and generous way what they need. Training, education, teaching, counseling, a hug, advice, listening, music, dance, song. I think Judaism has another round to go. So the last thing I want to say, and then I'm going to open it up, I'm sure you have lots you want to say. A lot of people have been bemoaning the intermarriage rate, which is somewhere around 60%, 70% of marriages that are happening now in the Jewish community are between a Jew and a non-Jew. That's high. The fourth generation Scandinavian intermarriage rate is 95%. It's a fluke. when a Scandinavian marries another Scandinavian. That's a mistake. They just weren't paying attention. It's the same for Japanese Americans, fourth generation. It's the same for French Americans, fourth generation, Italian American, Czech American. The Jewish intermarriage rate is actually astonishing for how low it is. It reflects a deep, deep commitment to the centrality of one's Jewish identity that it's down to 70%. Now, we can talk later about should we officiate, should we not. I have idiosyncratic feelings on this subject. But what I want to say is instead of wringing our hands and acting like something shameful is going on, what we need to do, and what seems to work most effectively, is to invite these people to our homes for Shabbat. The most important factor in a person converting to Judaism is their Jewish spouse. The second most important factor is their Jewish in-laws. Bomb them with Jewish love. Shabbos dinners, seders, the kind of neurotic embrace that we are so good at, because they're starving for a little warmth. It can be chilly in a Gentile home, right? And a house that's a little loose on boundaries, but big on hugging and being there, that's more appealing than you think. So this is not a time to throw in the towel. This is also not a time to get defensive and stodgy. This is a time to recognize that we are the children of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Rabbi Akiva, Bruriah, Judah Halevi, Maimonides, Sadia Gaon, Golda Meir. We are standing on the shoulders of greats, all of whom are shining the light of the Holy One into the world. And now it's your turn. So you don't have to be as great as them. You just have to be as great as you. Shalom.
Thank you. And so, as Rabbi Erickson said, he wanted to open it up. Again, as I said earlier, a question ends with a question mark, and we'll try to make space for as many people as possible.
Thank you. Do you have programs from your synagogue in LA or any of the places where you teach that you can provide as examples? The programs that the 25-year-olds actually go to.
So I will tell you that here's what life does to you. Either you pay attention and cooperate in Hebrew school the first time, or you're sentenced to life. And I was very bad in Hebrew school. So I was doomed to a life of Hebrew school, which is more or less what rabbinical school is. I don't have a synagogue. I run a rabbinical school. I don't have a synagogue. You people are retail. I am wholesale. I live in LA. I do. I go to Ikar, which is an amazing, incredible synagogue. They have lots of programs. Well, so the first thing, is this being filmed? Sharon Brous, you owe me for this. So part of what they have is not a program, it's them. Their synagogue doesn't feel like your parents' synagogue. The guy who's in charge of music, Hillel Tige, is amazing. And he doesn't play shul music. Sometimes I miss shul music. But he's not an ordained cantor, and he could do it if he wanted to, but he's a musician. So he writes his own music for everything, and it sounds like world music. And he's often known to play from the Beatles or from other groups I've never heard of. when their music is the music that fits what he thinks is the mood. So if you walk into the building unfamiliar with a synagogue, it takes you a while to figure out that that's what you've landed in, right? Second, the rabbis are incredibly adept at speaking about the meaning of prayers, not their history. When I went to rabbinical school, I was trained to tell you that the Aleinu was from the 13th century, and it was added to the blah, 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 and now let's pray. That's not really as inspiring as you might think. But they give little pieces where they talk about the need to take a pause, the need to breathe. And as we rise for this silent prayer, let's breathe together and use these words if they're helpful. Like they go into a whole, so it's always handing you moments of meaning. The sermons are spiritually deep and politically committed, which means it's not for everybody. You couldn't do it here, you'd blow up, right? But everyone who comes to Ikar thinks a certain way politically. Oh, so they give, no, we welcome everybody. It's just that when the sermon starts, many of them choose to leave. Well, because if welcome means you don't take a stand on the major issues of the day, then that's an odd sort of welcoming, right? I'm not taking my position here. You couldn't and shouldn't try that here. But Ikar was created to be a center of deep spirituality and social justice. So people who don't like that vision of social justice know not to go there. I've long thought somebody should open a right-wing Ikar. Why shouldn't there be a synagogue for people who are committed to the old Republican agenda, to have a place where that is affirmed in Jewish values and Jewish texts, and they feel like it's part of their spirituality? We've opted for a different thing in the American model. We have places that are politically parv. But that also puts us in a weird position. I'll give you just two for instances. We're politically parv except for Israel, and that seems to be the exception. There we take a strong particular political stand. And then on other big issues, should ICE be arresting your gardener? And you pick the issues you want. Should my wife have to leave the Justice Department? Right? On those things, we say nothing. And for a lot of people, they say, well, what kind of house of worship has got an opinion on whether I should do Musaf or not, but it has nothing to say about climate change? So that's a choice. Ikar doesn't make that choice. And it doesn't try to be everybody's synagogue. It tries to be, and it's one of LA's biggest synagogues now. It's got 1,300 member units. There are a lot of people who find that appealing. The rabbis are remarkable, and the community is remarkable. It's the most diverse synagogue I've ever been in. And they don't sit by age group. Like you sit at tables with whoever you want. I'll sit at a table with the person with the purple hair and the person who looks good in that dress, and I have no idea what gender they are, and someone who looks like they're my grandfather, and how are they still walking? Like, we all mingle with each other. And that's really beautiful. Years ago, Keshet, which is an LGBT rights organization, gave Ikar a B-. And they went bananas. Like, they went bananas, right? Why did they get a B-? Because they didn't have a gay committee. They just had a lesbian rabbi, and the president was, it was so weird, but Ikar doesn't want to tweak the model, it wants a different model. And then there are other synagogues that are much more establishment, VBS, Sinai, Temple, Beth Am, that are also doing great outreach programs in a way that is more immediately comparable to this. But here's what I want to offer you. You should send a delegation to Ikar. And you should go there not so that you can copy them. You can't. It would kill you. It would trash the institution. It won't be sustainable. But what you could do is you could say, oh, I didn't know that's possible. That's a good idea. If we tweak that, we could do that, right? I saw your rabbi calling up people and having them say something about everyone they're having a yard site for or whatever, that's an Ikar practice, right? So there's a lot to learn even from places that you're not going to mimic, right? But it needs to be attended to. They also do a lot of programming out of their building. They don't own a physical building right now. So they are doing Sunday hiking and Torah, and they're doing literary groups. They have a poetry group. They have a novel group. I read, what's it called, the Hillbilly Elegy for an Ikar reading group, and I told Rabbi Brous, you owe me the money for that book. Right? So, but look around and then also think out of the box. What are your kids? What would they want? What would they do? Not what do you think they should do? What would for them look like, oh, that's a cool Jewish thing, I'd want to participate in that. And then do it. Do it. But it means not just it means not just trying to meet the needs of the people currently affiliated. It means seeing yourself as the front lines of a catalytic process that's going to appeal to the people for whom this doesn't, and seeing that as part of your mission.
I want to make sure we get an opportunity for another question.
Sorry, I'll give shorter answers.
No, they're great. I know you had a question from earlier I didn't get to you.
It's okay. One of the things that seems to be a glue for them, and that's a question, that seems to be a glue is a strong moral underpinning of which we actually own, but we don't amplify. I think we don't amplify. And okay, you spoke about Ikar. I can talk about the synagogue in San Francisco, the kitchen, or I can talk about the synagogue in New York City, Romamu, where the underlying connection appears to be morality. And the other thing I saw seems to be, and this is a question, is American Jewish World Service, where many people go when they don't go to synagogue. I'm only guessing all of these are tied to that one underlying morality that attract people.
So
Feeling of community.
I do think that Romamu, the kitchen, have much greater coherence among their members than most established synagogues do. That makes it easy to have moral clarity, right? Because if everyone agrees, then you can take stands. But I think part of Romamu in the kitchen is their style of their music and their intimacy, and that it's not just the job of Rabbi Kushner, she's best of the best, but everyone at the kitchen is on a mission, and you don't walk into the kitchen and get ignored. And that is at least as important. I have long said, and been ignored by the conservative movement for the last 20 years, that if they wanted to transform the conservative movement, they should imitate Chabad. From now on, nobody walks into this room without getting a Shabbos invitation from a member. They can say no, but somebody has to invite them for a Shabbos meal, and if they leave without one, it's a failure. Which means it's not on the clergy, it's on you guys. You need to be hunting and saying, who do I not recognize? And then go and say, you look new here, come home for me with lunch, right? Or come next Friday night for dinner, or whatever. And that has to be your ongoing mission, right? That's when people talk to me about Chabad, it's not the theology that gets them, it's the meal and the being invited and the being seen, right? So that's not morality, that's hospitality. That's what it means to be truly welcoming. Nobody walks in here without an invitation from a congregant, right? And that's true of all of those institutions you've mentioned. The other thing I just want to repeat, I am not saying you should become Romamu or you should become the kitchen. There's a reason why all of the Bay Area can only have one kitchen, right? It's not a replicable model. It's a great model for the people for whom it works, but it's not a replicable model. I don't think Ikar is a widely replicable model. I just think it's awesome. But there are lots of awesome certainly in LA, and the synagogues here are also, many of them, doing wonderful things. But I think what we all need to do is add to our core mission the people in our neighborhoods who are not joining. And what are their human needs that we can help with, so that they see us as a center for that. Years ago, Valley Beth Shalom had a program in which members of the congregation who were therapists volunteered a night a week. And they saw clients who were members of the synagogue or not, but who signed up through the synagogue. And then they got lawyers to do that. So they had a legal clinic for people who were having legal problems and couldn't afford a lawyer. And Harold Schulweis, God bless him, saw that as the mission of a synagogue. Like, we're there to meet the human needs of our people, right? I think we have backed away from that because it's very intensive and it takes a high level of commitment, right? And unfortunately, what we've reduced it to is belonging to a synagogue means writing a check. And that's easy. And it turns out it's also not very gratifying. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Not. Right? But I'll just remind you one other thing. I'm sorry, these are long answers. I'm a rabbi, I can't help it. Plus, you can't fire me. One year for the high holidays, Rabbi Schulweis put out one of, those tickets that you flip down things for? In every synagogue, there are $100, $500, $1,000, $10,000 in your dreams, Rabbi, right? That lineup. But he put in volunteer opportunities. Read to the elderly, read to a preschool kid, read to an inner city kid, volunteer at a hospital, whatever. And he had that in every seat for Rosh Hashanah. And that became his sermon, right? We need to all do something. I think we've lost that in the Jewish world. We hire people. And I think, that's not exactly morality, that's human connection. I finished my answer.
I feel like I just want to say one thing.
See, he's a rabbi too.
Marin is its own geography, its own demographics. If you were here on Friday night, there was awesome music. If you were here this morning, there were a lot of young families with preschoolers around. If you're here at our Hanukkah party or a Purim spiel, you will see vibrant things happening across the generations. Just in case you start to think that things aren't happening here close so far. All right, my defensiveness is over. Who is next? All right, Steve.
Rabbi, I'd like to tie together what you spoke to us about this afternoon with what you're speaking with us about this evening. How do we go forward and contribute our piece to this next generation of Jews when so many young Jews have now decided that their Jewish families mean a rejection of Zionism, the state of Israel, that you spoke about this afternoon as being so important to us? I just feel that so much with that younger group, and I was wondering how you've encountered it.
On behalf of young people, which in this room I can still kind of represent, ooh. Hey, this is the natural color, babies. And it looks good on you. I think that's an exaggeration. I don't think most young Jews have decided to be anti-Zionist. I think most American Jews are tired of getting yelled at and lectured at, so they just walk away. But that's not the same as being anti-Zionist. They just don't want to get preached at all the time by the elderly. And they don't want to be told what they should think or feel about stuff that everyone yells at each other for. So the most recent polls show that most young Jews still identify with Israel. What you're confusing, and what many people are confusing, are the videos that make it onto the news. Right? But and it may be that in particular families there's something that plays out differently. I get calls not infrequently from very strongly Zionist parents geschrying that one of their kids is, that's a Yiddish term, sorry, that one of their kids opposes their Zionism. And I'll ask them, how many kids do you have? And they'll say 4. Okay, so statistically speaking, I mean, that would be very upsetting if it were my kid too, I get it. But that isn't young people have turned against Israel. It's that you have one kid who's really pissed at you. And then when you ask that kid, what he says is something like this. When I went to a day school and a Jewish camp, they never told me the whole story. I want to tell you that's true. They didn't. My kid went to Ramah. I love Camp Ramah. I support Camp Ramah. It didn't tell them the whole story, right? They never got to talk to a Palestinian. They never got to hear from an Arab what life is like in Israel. They heard from Israeli staff who were doing Hasbara. So then they get to college and they meet a Palestinian and they start hearing stuff that it's not that they weren't prepped to defend Israel. They weren't prepared to hear about someone whose family got jailed, right, without charges. And it horrifies them because you taught them due process of law. And so what happens when their country isn't practicing due process of law, right? And even if that kid tried to knife somebody, then bring them to trial and give them a sentence and give them a lawyer. That doesn't happen. So they hear these things and they haven't been prepared because they were taught Israel as Disneyland. We do them a disservice. We make anti-Zionists by the fairy tale story we tell them. Israel, in my opinion, does not have an obligation to be any more perfect than any country. If you can only love the United States because it has done no wrong, I have some very bad news for you. Right? Israel deserves the right to make mistakes and do bad things just like every other country, and then should be criticized just like every other country and should do better. But we don't give our kids permission to have that conversation. We immediately give them the lecture. And they end up, what I've said to parents after, if you only give your children one way to be Zionist, you have a hand in their anti-Zionism. I have plenty of Israeli friends who could articulate to them a Zionism they would feel absolutely at home with. But American Jews never hear that. So it's as much our fault as theirs. I'm sorry I said that this morning. It's still true. It's as much our fault as theirs. And fact, numerically speaking, it is untrue that younger Jews are anti-Zionist. It is simply false. And be careful of that polemic because our enemies will use it to show that we're wrong and they're right. They're not right. They're not going to outweight us because our kids are also pro-Zionist in astoundingly high numbers, as, by the way, are Americans. Don't get distracted by the news clippings, and don't get distracted by the noisy. I hate to admit it, but he's right. Richard Nixon talked about the silent majority, and it's true, right? Some people try to stop traffic on the 10, and some people vote. They're not the same. Keep your eye on the ball. Most Americans, the amount of American sympathy for Israel has risen since October. Right? It has gone up, not among Jews just, among Americans. And if you poll young Jews, they overwhelmingly continue to identify with Israel. But they're not going to tell the fairy tale version that we tell. And that version will push them away.
Maybe one more as we're getting, somebody hasn't got a chance. Okay, Jeff.
Rabbi, could we ask a woman?
I was looking for a woman.
Could a woman please raise her?
gotten in trouble
Could
for this
someone, thank you,
before.
there. So Sorry, I don't mean to be, I know that's not permissible under the
raising their
current
hand.
administration, but I still think, yeah, what I said that was the Israel is the third rail, and that any conversation about Israel is so explosive that it burns all who participate, which is why most rabbis, other than just a kind of very bland, yes, we love Israel, won't say anything substantive and won't create a framework for their congregants to have a conversation either, because whatever, in my rabbinical school, I have people who are Zionists on the left, Zionists in the center, Zionists on the right. They all feel picked upon and bullied, every one of them, right? And that is absolutely true. So part of what we also have to do, is create a synagogue culture in which we can, not from the bima, have conversations in which people are civil and allowed to disagree with each other and not be told they're idiots or uneducated. That's why you think what you think.
Is there a book that you could recommend that would help us explain to our kids the non-fairy tale version of Israel? That's part one of my question. And part two of my question is, I see a lot of work being done in the JCC world, and I'm wondering if you can comment on what we might, as a synagogue, learn from what they're doing on JCC in terms of inclusivity and not separating out Jewish versus non-Jewish, but just trying to educate the general public. What can synagogues learn from that model?
Great. So the first question, which is there a book that can help provide this broader perspective? I put in the category of, hello, Rabbi, I've pulled the pin on this hand grenade. Would you hold it, please? So thanks. And I will try very hard not to take it out on your daughter, the rabbi. I do have a book to recommend. It's not popular in some quarters in the Bay Area. David Sokach wrote a book on Israel. I forget the exact title. Some of you may remember it. Daniel, correct. Daniel Sokach wrote a book on Israel, and it is, to my mind, the best popular book on the subject. Because while it is solidly a Zionist book, meaning he advocates in favor of the existence of a Jewish state of Israel, he presents the Palestinian story fairly, which means there will be very uncomfortable pages to read in that book. There you go.
Can we talk about Israel? Daniel Sokach.
Can we talk about Israel? I recommend everyone read that book. Read it even if you're going to disagree with it, because it's what your kids think. Well, that's on a different subject. You should, for sure, read Dara Horn's "Everybody, the World Loves Dead Jews," but that's not really going to address the Israel part. This book will give you partly what your kids are starving for that they didn't get in their day school and their summer camp, or in their synagogues, by the way. All right, the second thing was the JCCs. I think we live in an age in which there need to be multiple approaches and not everyone doing the same thing. I'm okay with synagogues' lane being spirituality and spiritual-oriented learning and prayer. I think that's fine, and raising the kids. That's a big enough task, and to do that well is not a small thing. And there are things that the JCC can be working on that's different than that and on the border of that. Doing art, having a place for Jews to socialize and work out together, and book conversations, and there's other things that they can be doing, because again, I think that there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all anymore. There are going to be different points of Jewish entry, and the goal is to create enough points of entry that everybody finds theirs, right? And that's really, I think, the world we're moving into. So I don't want you to walk away thinking either we have to become ICAR or we have to become the JCC. I think we need to get used to having multiple kinds of Jewish institutions all advancing adjoining and sometimes conflicting ways of being Jewish.
Besides strengthening our Jewish identity, Jewish community from the young people on up, there are many young non-Jews that are turning against, because they hear propaganda and the Western media is incredibly biased against Israel. What do you suggest for how we help them to understand or just to question or to talk to them so that they don't hate Israel and think that we're such an oppressive state?
I can only answer part of that. So the first thing I want to remind you of is if you ask any spokesman for a Muslim or Palestinian organization, is the Western press anti-Israel? They will laugh at you. And they routinely say that it's anti-Muslim. So we have succeeded in creating a media that everyone hates. And that's because the media isn't following anyone's line. Like, they don't tell the Jewish story by itself. They don't tell the Western story by itself. There are individual headlines and articles that are outrageous. But there are articles about Muslims that are outrageous too, and that just seems to be the nature of what sells papers and the salacious nature of American media. But if you look at polls of American young, they are overwhelmingly pro-Israel. You're getting confused by who's on the street. We can't afford to do that. So I want to say this in the baldest possible language. If you had to choose between being an anti-Semite in America or being a Jew, you would overwhelmingly want to be a Jew. When we have a problem, we call the government. And we don't call them on their public line. We find someone who knows someone who knows someone, and we talk to them. Hi, Gavin, we say, right? Do you realize that in the last presidential election, when it was still Biden versus Trump, we had 2 American presidents who had Jewish chiefs of staff and who had Jewish grandchildren? You don't think that makes pro-Palestinian people nuts? Like, where there are articles in the paper every day now, Arabs from Michigan saying, if I had known he was going to do this, I would never have voted for him. I was like, are you out of your mind? You could have called me, I would have told you what he was going to do. I have no sympathy for the Latino whose father has been picked up by ICE and said, I didn't expect him to pick up Dad. Give me a break. Okay, but we need to not, we have to be smarter than that. I share your pain. I share your frustration. I read quotations from some college students. It makes me crazy. I think somehow their education has been a dismal failure. True. But that's not an issue of better propaganda. And they represent a small number of people. At UCLA, there are 1,500 people in the quad and 30,000 going to class. And Trump won the election, right? And they didn't like Harris because she was too Zionist. So you had a choice between too Zionist and way too Zionist. Like, that was the choice in the election, right? How many people voted for what's-her-face Stein, right? You know, there you go. There were Democrats who ran in the primary who were anti-Israel. There are even anti-Israel Republicans. They don't get oxygen, right? So don't panic. Really, that's my don't panic. Take it seriously. We need to be active. We need to be involved. There are issues in the state legislature and in state policy, in pedagogy in the schools, in how this gets taught. There are excesses in the DEI curriculum, not in DEI itself, but in the curriculum that need correction. And we need to fight for those corrections. We need to tell our story honestly, which includes there are things Israel could do better, and what Israel represents in the West Bank is different than what Israel represents in the Galil. Those are all things we have to be willing to talk about. But if you go based on public support of Israel versus public support of Palestine, in any poll, you do not want to be on the pro-Palestine side. And that's across the spectrum, right? A vote on Iron Dome gets congressional support at the level that nothing gets. You get 10 congresspeople vote against it. What other issue does every congressperson vote in favor of but 10? Right? Nothing. So don't give in to hysteria. Really, it doesn't help our cause. Right? Stand in the strength that you have. The American people have heard the pro-Pal people, and they have written them off. And they write them off for very good reasons. Some of it's substantive, some of it is we resent when they desecrate our statues and try to burn our flags and try to beat up civilians. And like they've discredited themselves. Don't give them the power they don't have. It doesn't serve. AIPAC got involved in elections this year. I assume many of you know that, and some of you participated in that. The vast majority of elections that AIPAC got involved with, they won. That is to say, I think we won, right? So there are less people hating Israel in Congress than there were 2 years ago, and that's because we wouldn't put up with it anymore. Focus. Focus, people, and don't give in to the news cycle, don't give in to Twitter, don't give in to the social media. It is a cesspool out there, right? But it's a cesspool of the powerless whose voices are artificially magnified. Don't get distracted. I think I've worn you out.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Really wonderful. Broad and scope and deep, and we're all very grateful for your time and your energy and your wisdom and what you've shared with us. And once again, thank you for coming out. Thank you who are on Zoom. I know there are many people on Zoom as well. And we'll have one more opportunity to learn with Rabbi Artson tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. and hope to see you all there. Have a great night. Drive safe. Be careful.